Welcome, everyone. This is the Booktalk Nation event with Sam Kean and Carl Zimmer. This will work a little bit like an author event in a bookstore. Sam will talk about his new book, The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, The History of the Human Brain as Revealed by True Stories of Trauma, Madness, and Recovery. If you haven't purchased The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, you can do so at booktalknation.com or right here on this video page, and Sam will sign and personalize it for you. The bookstore, Politics and Prose, will fulfill all of the orders and ship them to your door. The sales for these signed and personalized copies will close tomorrow night, so you'll want to make sure you have your order in by then. You'll notice that there is a chat box right down there underneath this video window. You can use that chat box to interact with Sam during the video chat and answer your questions. In about 20 minutes, Sam will answer the questions from that chat and also answer some of the questions that you submitted ahead of time when you RSVP'd for the event. Until then, I'm going to hand it over to Carl Zimmer. Carl Zimmer is a columnist for the New York Times, where his column Matter appears each Thursday. In his books, essays, articles, and blog posts, Zimmer reports from the frontier of biology, where scientists are expanding our understanding of life. So welcome, Sam and Carl. And Carl, I can turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
No problem.
So, Sam, I thought maybe a good place to start would be to kind of get a sense from you about what the book is about. I mean, the title obviously gets across that this is a book about the brain, but there are lots of books about the brain, a huge amount of books about the brain, but yours has got an interesting approach to it, and an approach to the history of neuroscience. So maybe you could kind of give us a feel for what your approach is to this incredibly daunting subject.
Sure. So basically, I'm looking at the history of neuroscience and a lot of the most famous cases from the history of neuroscience. And almost all of them have one common theme, which is that they involve an injury of some sort to some part of the brain. And based on that injury, something about the person's behavior changes. So, suddenly afterward, parents can't recognize their children, or, people become pathological liars, something like that. And basically, the book marches around the brain from part to part and shows you what happens when each part of the brain goes down. And really, that's how we learned almost everything we know about the brain from the history of neuroscience, is just from these fascinating case studies of people who were unlucky enough to have injury in one part of the brain, and then something kind of radically changed about them. So it's really a collection of all of these different stories.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I don't think people realize that the neuroscience really has kind of depended on these cases, and you have this great quote from the book in the book from a neuroscientist who says that no brain is better than a bad brain. So, I mean, why is it? Do you think, having looked at all these cases, that neuroscientists just love to study these really dramatic and sometimes kind of scary cases of brain damage, basically?
I think it's mostly because you can see the effects so quickly. You can interact with someone who doesn't have a memory anymore, or who can't speak suddenly, something like that. So you see a lot of times these really drastic changes, and there's really no better way to figure out what a part of the brain does than to see what happens when it gets destroyed or it shorts out. It's in a lot of ways just like a natural experiment. If you could experiment on a brain, you would take a switch and maybe shut off part of it, see how it works afterward, like you could do with another physical system. Obviously, we can't do that for ethical reasons, so we have to wait around for these stories to just happen to people and then see what happens to them afterward.
Yeah, although what's interesting, I mean, and what you show in your book, is that some of the most interesting cases of these bad brains arose before people really knew what it signified. And in fact, the title of the book, the Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, you've got you're going back to these early times. Maybe you could sort of talk a little bit about that example. I mean, it's this great story about this jousting king and so on. I mean, maybe you could just kind of give people a sense of what that particular story is about, because it's so, this is happening hundreds of years before people really have a clue what's going on in the brain.
Yeah, so the story involves a king of France named Henry II, who was kind of this big macho king. He liked to hunt and joust and things like that. And in 1559, one day, he was in a jousting match, and he got sort of clobbered in the face by a lance. And they brought in the two best neurosurgeons in Europe to try to save him. And a lot of people thought that the king would be okay because he didn't have any skull fracture. I mean, there was a little bit of blood, but it wasn't a really particularly gory wound or anything like that. So they figured, oh, the king will be fine. But these two neurosurgeons who came in, Andreas Vesalius and Ambrose Paré, they realized that he had suffered from what we now call a concussion. And it was kind of a controversial diagnosis then. People really didn't believe in it. The analogy I heard was they kind of believed that the head was a bit like an egg, where if the shell isn't cracked, then the yolk inside is probably okay. And people figured, well, if the skull is fine, then the brain itself must be fine as well. But Paré and Vesalius realized that the brain is different. It doesn't quite work that way. And they realized the king was actually in some pretty grave danger here, even though there was no damage from the outside. And I kind of liked it for the title story for a few reasons. One, it does kind of show the genesis of neuroscience, way back in the 1500s. Not only how people reasoned way back then, but the fact that they were talking about concussions. There were people doing neurosurgery back then. It's not something we usually think about. And I also liked it because I do think we're dealing with a lot of these same issues today. You hear about football players, hockey players, soldiers, people suffering from injuries to their brain, and because there's no obvious wound on the outside, they think they're okay, or they think they shouldn't be feeling any symptoms, things like that. So in some ways, we're kind of still relearning these hard lessons. So that's kind of where the title of the book comes from.
Yeah, it was interesting how you could tell these stories from 500 years ago or 150 years ago, and they're very relevant to today. And it isn't just coming to terms with concussions and what to do about them, but these other issues that you talk about. Issues about people's personalities or consciousness and all these things. We still have a long way to go to figure them out. So it was striking to me just how kind of relevant they really are, just because we still don't know that much about the brain.
Yeah, so I mean, we have these amazing tools right now, these brain scanning tools. You can do things like give someone a transcranial magnetic pulse and sort of shut down part of their brain for a little bit. But these stories and these cases of injury are still very important today, and a lot of the people in the book are still alive. We're still learning things from them. So yeah, these stories are absolutely relevant to not only understanding where neuroscience came from, how we learned what we learned, but also, as you said, these big level things about free will, consciousness. We can get at some of those questions through these case studies even today.
Yeah, I mean, I wondered if you sort of noticed kind of a different kind of vibe coming from the stories of, seems like there are a couple of different kinds of stories here. Like you have stories of these kind of quick encounters, maybe a surgeon dealing with a patient, in an emergency, like the king. And then there are these other cases which are kind of like, really intimate, lifelong, practically relationships, where there are these examples of people who have had these brain injuries that affect their memory. You mentioned that, and I've been struck by how these neuroscientists, some of them have spent decades working with these people and trying to understand them, and it's this fascinating relationship that they get into. I mean, do you think that you learn different things from these different kinds of relationships with these, with these injured brains?
Yeah, I mean, some of the cases, what's wrong with the person is wrong immediately and obviously. People who suddenly can't recognize faces or something like that. It's pretty quickly clear that that is a deficit. Or, there are stories of people who suddenly can't recognize any animals or something like that. It becomes pretty clear pretty quickly what the problem is. But there are these other cases where it takes a lot of work. There are subtleties that you really have to tease out over a long time. One of the good examples was what you mentioned, was memory. One of the famous memory cases of all time, H.M. I talk a lot about him in the book and some of the things that he helped us learn, but these weren't things that were immediately obvious. For instance, we did learn from him that we have different memory systems in the brain. So when we're talking about memory sort of day to day, we lump everything together. Like, I remember how to ride a bicycle. I remember dates. I remember names, facts. We talk about all those things as memory. But they're really involved with different systems in the brain, and some of them in HM were destroyed, but he was able to retain other ones. So because these people worked with him for decades in some cases, they were really able to tease out these different ideas, these different memory systems. And so yeah, in a lot of cases it was just the intimate work, decades and decades of work, where we're really able to see the importance of these things for the first time.
Now, there are some stories about brains that have been told many times, and there are a few that anybody who is at all interested in the brain, they've come across these stories, and your challenge, I think, in a book like this, one of the challenges is to basically give your own, tell your own version of these stories to bring something new to it. So I would guess that the most told tale is about this man named Phineas Gage in the 19th century. Just the name Phineas Gage, will probably light up memories for a lot of people. It's such a great name. But so maybe you could quickly tell the standard story of Phineas Gage, and just sort of talk a little bit about how in the book you wanted to kind of breathe new life into it.
Yeah, so there are stories that people have probably heard about in textbooks, things like that. Usually, though, you just get sort of a one paragraph or a few sentences about it, and Gage is probably the best example of that. He was the railroad worker in Vermont in the 1840s, and he had a huge railroad spike sort of blow through the top of his head and come out the other side. And the fact that he survived this was just amazing. It's an incredible story. Just the first few minutes that he made it, that he was able to get up, walk away from this without any major problems, major obvious problems, at least in the short term. There were some changes that took place, however, to his personality. And this is where things get a little nebulous. Excuse me. Because the story I think most people hear is that Phineas Gage changed afterwards and changed for the worse. He became sort of this drunken lout or a criminal of some sort, or almost sort of schizophrenic. There was just something very wrong with him after this injury. And actually, if you go back to the historical record and look at it, there's almost no evidence that something so drastic, and especially that something really bad, did happen to him. We know he did change, but it's not clear exactly how he changed. They weren't using the same vocabulary we have today. They didn't run a lot of the same tests on him we would do today. So it's a little unclear exactly what happened. And in fact, some historians have argued that there's decent evidence that Phineas Gage actually recovered. And, he didn't turn into the old Phineas Gage again. He didn't recover completely. But he might have recovered some lost skills, some lost faculties, things like that. For instance, one part of the story that almost always gets left out is the fact that he went down to Chile for 7 years and lived kind of an independent life, driving horses for himself, down in Chile. That's not something you would expect of a person with severe brain damage, to go to a different country, pick up a new language, be in charge of driving people around, things like that. So again, the standard textbook story of Gage's case kind of, it seems a little misleading to me. And so one of the challenges of the book, as you said, was to kind of make these stories fresh and interesting. And one of the ways I think to do that is kind of give the whole context of the person's life. Because I think when you do that, you can appreciate that, well, this person had this deficit of some sort, but maybe they recovered or they compensated in some way. Or maybe if you learn a little bit more about their life, you can see their entire life and really get a better idea for who the person was and how their personality deficit or their memory deficit really did affect the whole of their lives. So you start to see them as a full person, I think.
Do you have any theories about how this kind of incomplete story of Phineas Gage kind of took hold? I mean, were there people who were sort of saw it as sort of embodying some view they had of neuroscience, and so he became this useful tool for them? Is that how it happened?
Yeah, I think basically what happened is that Gage's doctor, who wrote up a report on him, was a little ambiguous in certain cases. He was especially ambiguous about kind of the time frame, about when he was suffering from certain things, whether he got better, things like that. And I think with ambiguous cases like that, it's just easy to read too much into it. You can kind of read what you want into it, and there were a lot of theories going on about how the brain worked in the 1800s. We were starting to see the theory of localization come up. You were starting to see a revival in phrenology, and each one of these groups sort of seized on one part of the story and started talking about it. Some historians have also talked about the rumors that Gage became an alcoholic, something like that. They kind of traced it to someone mentioning that Gage had symptoms that reminded him of an alcoholic he once knew, and then the story gets told the next time and they leave out a little bit of detail. It's just a game of scientific telephone that keeps getting on, and eventually you stop going back to the original sources and you just have this picture, this sort of distorted picture of who they think Phineas Gage was. But again, when you go back and look at the record, it's a much different story.
I found myself reading the book sometimes just trying to use my imagination to try to put myself in the place of some of these people. To think about what it's like, say, like if your brain is split so that your two hemispheres are kind of working independently, or like to suddenly decide that your family are imposters, that somehow someone was put in your house, or to just wake up every morning and basically forget everything that happened since you were 15. It's hard and sometimes a little scary, and I'm just sort of wondering if any of these conditions that you wrote about, any of these people with these these altered brains, sort of got you thinking especially hard about what the quality of that experience is like, what it's like to be that in that kind of a state of mind.
Yeah, I think all of the people, when you want to tell a story about someone, whether it's a fictional story or whether it's nonfiction, true stories like these stories, I think you really do have to put yourself in the other person's place and imagine what it's like. I mean, you can talk about someone's memory not being there, and you can think, oh, that'd be terrible. But when you really sit down and try to put yourself in that person's position and realize day to day just all of the things that disappear, your sense of time passing, your sense of your family, not being able to recognize people, just sort of the daily sense. Like, a lot of these people know something is kind of wrong, but they can't quite put their finger on it. So I think that putting yourself in the person's shoes like that really does make it a richer and more interesting experience. And it really does affect the way you approach and think about these people and how you kind of think about the brain, too. One thing I do remember also with all these stories, something that really struck me was there were very few cases where people would sort of lose a sense of personal identity or a sense of kind of who they are deep down. And in some ways, that was a little comforting to me because even these cases where people's memory got wiped out, they still did remember who they are. And it's that sense of self is pretty tenacious in the brain. It's pretty hard to dislodge that. And so I think that was something that kind of surprised me, that you could lose something, even your entire memory, you would still kind of know who you were deep down.
Hmm. Do you see much benefit in terms of understanding these cases, these damaged brains, in terms of actually leading to real, say, medical treatment? I mean, we get these insights into how the brain works by seeing, someone who's, had a stroke and that's affected a region that affects language. That tells us something about language, but do scientists go the next step and say, like, okay, based on what we've learned from these individuals, here's a treatment for some particular condition?
I think in some cases you can get an idea. Obviously, the most important thing about them is just understanding what each part of the brain does, which is kind of the basis for moving forward, developing any sort of treatment. I do think there are cases, though, that show people recovering over time. And I think just the mere fact that they do recover some lost skills, or their brain develops a way to compensate for that, I think that does give people hope that we can recover some lost skills, lost faculties. A century ago, neuroscientists would have said, no, there's no way you can recover something after it's lost. But nowadays, I think we're in a much better position to appreciate that you can recover some things. So I think there's at least a sense of hope reading these cases that we can at least, there's a shot that people will get better, which, obviously is the first step, is believing that it can happen.
Yeah. Now, David tells me that we've got some questions from people who've been watching. So, David, why don't you shoot Sam some questions?
Okay.
That was a great first 20 minutes. Thanks for the great interview, great answers. But now we have some questions from fans, and we have some pre-submitted ones. So I want to start with some of those.
Okay.
If you have questions, feel free to post up on the in the chat room, and we will answer. We will ask Sam these questions live. So the first question we have is from Zane. What have you to say about mixed states in the bipolar spectrum, causes and possible treatments?
I go a little bit into bipolar things in the brain, but not a whole lot into those. Those are something that we have been able to control at least somewhat with drugs, and I'm not sure scientists really have a good idea, of what exactly causes these huge swings from side to side. So it's a bit of a mystery, and it's also kind of a mystery why, some of these drugs we have work. One of the first drugs we developed was lithium, which is just a metal on the periodic table, and it's sort of strange that you would be able to put this metal inside you and that it could calm your moods down. It could sort of keep you on an even keel, things like that. So, it's still a bit of a mystery about why people have these wide swings.
This question is from Becca. Were there any stories that you found that were very interesting but didn't make the cut for the book? And if so, would you be interested in sharing some of those tonight?
Ooh, let's see. Yeah, I mean, there were always stories where you just had to, leave them out a little bit, things like that. One story I did get into was the idea, that I didn't get into was, I remember this story about Abraham Lincoln and the insanity defense. Abraham Lincoln tried a very early case with the insanity defense, and it was a very interesting idea that you could be temporarily insane, and to think about Abraham Lincoln being very involved with the science, things like that. Also, some stories about anesthesia, going under, how that kind of affects your consciousness, things like that. I came across them, but didn't quite find a place in the book where I wanted to use them. So maybe a future book for those.
Elizabeth has a question that she just posted online, and she says, my cousin and I were a little lost on your bubble theory. Can you break it down a little more?
My bubble theory.
Well, I'm sorry, sorry. That might be the incorrect. That might be the incorrect word there. Let's move on to the next question. That's okay. If you don't know what it is, then I don't think it's correct. What was the most surprising thing you learned while working on this book?
The thing that really sticks out in my mind is just how startlingly specific some of the things that people lost were. You could lose things like the ability to speak, but you could still sing despite not being able to speak. Or I mentioned people who lost the ability to recognize animals, but they could still recognize plants or human-made objects, or other people who could not recognize plants, but they could recognize animals. And in fact, those are the kind of stories that actually sort of inspired me to write the book, because I was reading about them and I just said, there's no way that those stories are true. I just don't believe those. And I ended up doing some research on it, figuring out that not only the stories were true, but that they kind of revealed some interesting things about how the brain worked. And so that kind of got me interested in the idea overall.
Gotcha. This question comes from Heidi from Massachusetts. She writes, do you prefer writing books or articles better? And do your research methods differ for each?
It depends a little bit on what you want to do. There's articles, you're obviously dealing usually with something a little newer, kind of fresh. It's new science, so you really feel like you're on the cusp of explaining something to a lot of people. And it's sort of satisfying that way. I like books, though, because you can really get in-depth into the topic. You can provide a lot of historical context, really get into depth with the people's lives. And for me, I feel like that's the more I just feel more comfortable writing in that sense, where you can take a little bit more time, have a little bit, greater room for context, things like that. And when you are doing an article, at least for me, I think I'm a little more, talking with people on the phone, maybe doing a visit, things like that. Whereas with the book, it's maybe a little more kind of historical research, things like that.
Gotcha. And this is actually a good lead into the next question that we had. Books are actually more, there's a lot more content than an article. How do you stay organized and focused on the story that needs to be told when you're undergoing such a lengthy research process?
For me, I just break things down chapter by chapter and kind of keep each chapter independent. Obviously there's going to be bleed over, there's going to be some stories that pop up, in different chapters, characters coming back, things like that. But I really try to think about each chapter as sort of self-contained, and so I'm trying to make an interesting beginning, a good conclusion that gives you a satisfaction, a sense of having learned something, and then just right from the beginning to the end within each chapter. So I look at each chapter as kind of a long article, and then at the end of it, when I have all of them together, it's when I go back and try to make the transitions a little better and make sure that the book is building in the proper way.
Gotcha. And so you're talking about having the readers having a satisfying conclusion in your chapters. What is the one thing that you want your readers to walk away with after reading this book?
I think there are a couple things. One, obviously I want the reader to know kind of how each part of the brain works, just in a general sense. What's it responsible for, what happens when it gets injured, things like that. Another thing I really emphasize throughout the book is that there's no one part of the brain that's just in charge of memory, or just in charge of language, or just in charge of your personality. All of those complicated and sophisticated traits really involve lots of regions of your brain working together. So I really wanted to give people a sense of how different parts not only work by themselves, but how they give rise to these other things like memory and language. The last thing I wanted people to be able to do is, there's a lot of neuroscience coming out right now, a lot of new studies, a lot of new initiatives, things like that. So I wanted people to be able to read a book like this and at least have some sense of familiarity with what's going on. What are the big debates? What are neuroscientists interested in, excited about, things like that. So hopefully it's something that you can kind of use going forward in the future as well.
Time for a few more. This next question, it seems like there's a lot of history involved in the book and there's a lot of science involved in the book. What is more important and what comes out more in the book?
Well, ideally, you obviously want to blend both of them because in these cases, you can't really separate the science from the history a lot of times. And in some cases, I really don't think you have to when it comes to neuroscience. I really think neuroscience, probably stories are more important to neuroscience than maybe any other field out there because you are dealing with people's day-to-day lives. You're dealing with how they relate to others, their emotions, memories, things like that. So in order to understand the science, you do have to understand a lot of the history and really get into the stories behind people. I do always make sure I emphasize the stories and make sure I think they are worthwhile stories. It's what I want to do. I feel like I'm a storyteller, but in order to understand the stories, I think you do need to get into the science. And I think you can learn a lot more science than you might expect just by telling stories, because I think that's how the human brain just remembers information. When it's presented to us in a story, that's really how we remember it best.
We have time for two more quick questions. They both come from Elizabeth in the chat room.
Okay.
She wants to know, what is your next project, first of all, and then we can go into the next question after that, which is a little easier and a little more fun.
A little lead-in, okay. Well, my editor and I right now are talking about some ideas. We haven't quite nailed it down yet. You know, there's a lot of things I'm excited about, enthusiastic about, but have to make sure they can kind of support a whole book yet. So it looks like I'm probably going to go kind of back toward chemistry with the next book, but we haven't quite nailed it down exactly yet.
And the last question is, what do you like to read for fun when you get time to read, and who are your favorite authors? I guess that's two questions, but
well, I can handle that. So I try to read as widely as possible, just to see. You know, I really enjoy reading about everything, and when I talk about science, I want to bring in as much as possible. I'm looking over what I have right now. I have How Proust Can Change Your Life. There's a book on the Civil War I'm reading. There was a novel I was reading. So I really, try to read as widely as possible. Some of my favorite authors, probably my favorite author ever is David Foster Wallace, especially the nonfiction he did. So I would put him at the top of the list.
That's good to know. Thank you very much. We appreciate that, and thank you everybody for submitting all of your questions. But that brings us about to the end of our event tonight. Before I let everyone go, I want to remind them that the books are for sale. You can purchase a signed and personalized copy of The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons. There's a lot more to that title, but that's where we're going to leave it for now. Right? You can purchase a copy of that book right here on this page. Those sales will close tomorrow night, so make sure to get your orders in by then, and Sam will sign and personalize the copy for you, and then Politics and Prose will ship it right to your door. We'd like to give a big thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting this event tonight, and also thank you to everyone who joined us for the event and submitted questions. And Sam and Carl, it was a pleasure having you guys on tonight. It was a really enlightening and very interesting talk about where science and history meet together, and a lot about neuroscience. So hopefully everybody will buy the book and enjoy it, because it seems really great. So thank you, everyone, and have a great night. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Okay. If you didn't get your question answered, feel free to email me through my website. That's perfectly fine. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great night, everybody.